to our community Bible study for Thursday, October the 21st. We are continuing our study in Genesis, and today we are going to read about Joseph, whose brothers sold him into slavery and ended up in Egypt. And I don't know, that seems like that would have been a pretty poor circumstance to happen to you in life. And yet we're going to read about Joseph going forward. So let's have a prayer. Lord, we do thank you for people in whose lives you have worked and we are able to learn and reap the benefit from. Help us today to grow in our faith and to grow closer to you. Amen. So the main ideas of these chapters, Genesis 39 through 41, the three main ideas as I see them is that the Lord had plans for Joseph and blessed him even when he faced the most difficult of circumstances, and he had several bad chapters in life. Joseph survived life in prison and uses his gift of interpreting dreams. And when he interprets the dreams of Pharaoh, he becomes a ruler over Egypt. And I thought I'd try to do a little perspective of what was going on in Egypt during the time that Joseph was arrived. We have the timeline of Egyptian history, and over the years, archaeologists, historians have been able to piece together a pretty good timeline with a lot of information of who the pharaohs were, what they did during their life. A lot of it was recorded in hieroglyphics, and some of those things. And Joseph, and then we have the Bible history, and we try to plug the two together. And we know we're not exact, but we do think that when Joseph arrived in Egypt, it was about what historians call Egypt's Middle Kingdom, a time of prosperity, a time where both one pharaoh and then the next expanded the irrigation system to provide a great lush croplands, especially for wheat and grain and such. And so Egypt was prosperous during those times. If you look for a picture of the pyramids today, you will probably most notably find the three large ones near Cairo that are attributed to Pharaoh Khufu, built in about 2,500 years before Christ. And those were already there in existence for probably 12 or 1,300 years before Joseph arrives in about the year 1876 before Christ. So part of my point is that Egypt for so long had been this strong and mighty nation, partly because it had the benefit of the Nile River and had all these leaders over and over that had been wise pretty much in how they ran Egypt. So Joseph arrives as a slave in one of the more powerful nations of the earth in that period of time. So Genesis 39 is where Joseph arrives in Egypt. Now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Potiphar, an Egyptian who was one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him there. The Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, and he lived in the house of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him, and the Lord gave him success in everything he did, Joseph found favor in his eyes and became his attendant. So Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything he owned. So Joseph clearly was quite capable, and the Lord was with him, so what he did was successful. Verse 5. From the time he put Joseph in charge of his household and of all that he owned, The Lord blessed the household of the Egyptian because of Joseph. The blessing of the Lord was on everything Potiphar had, both in the house and in the field. Now we'll skip a little bit. It says, now Joseph was well built and handsome. So Joseph wasn't someone to be discarded. Joseph was someone who was noticed and talented and capable and well built and handsome, which now causes a problem. Verse 7, after a while, his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, come to bed with me. But he refused. Well, that's not the end of the story. Verse 11, one day, Joseph went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. I think that the wife of Potiphar had made a point that no one would be there so she could have time alone with Joseph. She caught him by his cloak and said, come to bed with me. But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Can you imagine that he took off in a hurry? Verse 14. She called her household servants. Look, she said to them, this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. Now, isn't it something how she twisted the story completely? She wanted him when she was rejected. She called him this Hebrew. Clearly, this foreigner has been brought here to make sport of us, to humiliate us. That's what she was claiming. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed, and then he ran off and left half of his clothing behind. The interesting thing is, I wonder whether the servants believed her or not, because they may, or it would be interesting to know, they may have known more about what was going on than she thought. But, verse 19, when his master heard the story his wife told him, this group of lies, saying, this is how your slave treated me, he burned with anger. Joseph's master took him, put him in prison, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. Joseph, as a slave, had no legal standing. He was tossed aside. It's interesting, though, because he ends up in not just any prison in Egypt. I'm sure they were all equally bad. Prisons are not known to be good places. But it ended up being a prison where the king would send his prisoners. And this turns out to be a good thing for Joseph eventually. So back to verse 20. While Joseph was there in prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all of those held in prison, and he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Now remember, as we tell this story, we don't know anything about Joseph's ego or Joseph's sense of himself here, because we certainly know that when he was a younger man, he had a great deal of sense of himself as important. But even, a few months later, after being sold as a slave, I suspect that was beginning to change. But here, the story reminds us every few sentences that the Lord was with Joseph. The Lord was the one who gave him success, not just because he was outstanding. Well, chapter 40 is about Joseph in the prison. Sometime later, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their master, the king of Egypt. Pharaoh was angry at them, put them in the same prison where Joseph was confined. After they had been in custody for some time, each of the two men had a dream on the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now you can read more of the details, but here's the important part. Verse 9. So the chief cupbearer told Joseph his dream. He said to him, in my dream I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand. This is what it means, Joseph said to him. The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position. And you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer. But when all goes well with you, please remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon. Well, Joseph asked. So then the chief baker comes, verse 16. When the chief baker saw Joseph had given a favorable interpretation, he said to Joseph, I too had a dream. On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head. This is what it means, Joseph said. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh. Not such a nice interpretation.
Yeah.
Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday. Of course, 3 days later. Excuse me. So the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, rose him up out of prison, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said in his interpretation. We don't know why, but this is what happened. The chief cupbearer, however, did not remember Joseph. He forgot him. He was glad to have his job back. Well, we move on to the next chapter, which is Genesis 41. And we have Joseph meets up with Pharaoh. Now, think about this. Joseph, the 17-year-old boy who left and was sold into slavery, whose father thinks he's dead, who was the lowest possible in society, down in the dungeon of a prison, ends up meeting Pharaoh, the king of one of the mightiest nations. So here we go. Chapter 41. When 2 full years had passed. That's a long time to wait. Pharaoh had a dream. He was standing by the Nile when out of the river came up 7 cows, sleek and fat, and they grazed among the reeds. After them, 7 other cows, ugly and gaunt, came up out of the Nile and stood beside those on the riverbank. The cows that were ugly and gaunt ate up the sleek, fat cows. Then Pharaoh woke up.
Thank you.
Verse 5. He fell asleep again and had a second dream. 7 heads of grain, healthy and good, were growing on a single stalk. That's a good stalk of wheat. After them, 7 other heads of grain sprouted, thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy, full heads. Then Pharaoh woke up. It had been a dream. In the morning, his mind was troubled, so he sent for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but no one could interpret them for him. Then, 2 years later, the cupbearer told Pharaoh, "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings. Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now, a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." So Pharaoh sent for Joseph, and he was quickly brought from the dungeon. When he shaved and changed his clothes, he came before Pharaoh. Wow. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, well, let me stop here a second. One of the thoughts I had was when Joseph was younger and in his relations with his father and his brothers, he was arrogant. He was sure that his dreams made it a sign of how he was lording over the other family members, and that wasn't received very well. So that arrogance, that sense of confidence, was a liability at the time and in the way he used it. However, I'm thinking here when Pharaoh calls this prisoner named Joseph up out of prison, that confidence, maybe even a little arrogance, might have been tempered a bit for the years he was there, but it also was useful as he spoke to Pharaoh, because he was able to stand his ground and respond well. So here's Joseph's response. Pharaoh tells him, "In my dream I was standing on the bank of the Nile, when out of the river came up 7 cows, fat and sleek, and they grazed among the reeds. After them 7 other cows came up, scrawny and very ugly and lean. I had never seen such ugly cows in all the land of Egypt. The lean, ugly cows ate up the 7 fat cows that came first. But even as they ate them, no one could tell that they had eaten anything. They looked just as ugly and scrawny as before. Then I woke up. In my dream, I saw 7 heads of grain, full and good, growing on a single stalk. After them, 7 other heads sprouted, withered and thin, and scorched by the east wind from the desert. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 good heads. I told this to the magicians, but none of them could explain it to me." Verse 25. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what he is about to do." So it's a warning. "The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain, scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. And now," he said to Pharaoh, "let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man, and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come on Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine. The plan seemed good to Pharaoh and to his officials. So Pharaoh asked them, "Can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God?" Isn't it interesting how they recognized God's work in Joseph, even though they were of a different religion and a different faith, but God's work was still obvious. So Joseph is put in charge. Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt." Prisoner number 2 in the country. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He made him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and the people shouted before him, "Make way!" Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. He arrived in Egypt as a slave on a caravan, and now he's riding in a chariot with the Pharaoh. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. That's 13 years after he was sold by his brothers. And Joseph went out from Pharaoh's presence and traveled throughout Egypt. During the 7 years of abundance, the land produced plentifully. Joseph collected all the food produced in those 7 years of abundance in Egypt and stored it in the cities. In each city, he put the food grown in the fields surrounding it. Joseph stored up huge quantities of grain, like the sand of the sea. It was so much that he stopped keeping records because it was beyond measure. Wow. The 7 years of abundance in Egypt then came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began, just as Joseph had said. There was famine in all the other lands too, but in the whole land of Egypt there was food. When all Egypt began to feel the famine, the people cried to Pharaoh for food, and Pharaoh told the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph and do what he tells you." When the famine had spread over the whole country, Joseph opened up the storehouses and sold grain to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe throughout Egypt. And all the world came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe everywhere. What a change. Joseph went from the slave who got lucky in the master who chose him, maybe not so lucky with the master's wife, and then he now, 13 years later, is the #1 assistant to the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh. And, you know, remember how strong of a nation Egypt was. And so all the people around in different nations around that part of the world would come for food. And as we will learn next week, Joseph's family, who haven't seen him in 13 years, whose father thinks he's dead, will also come to Egypt asking for help, and we'll see what happens. It is a testimony to God's plans for Joseph, that no matter what situation he found himself in, that I'm sure was discouraging, disheartening, difficult to live through during those 13 years. God still helped him not only get through them, but to rise to the best that he could in those circumstances. As a slave, he was probably beaten before he ever got to Egypt. He's accused of adultery that he didn't do. He ends up in prison, and even if it was the king's prison, I'm sure it was not a nice place. and he thinks maybe the cupbearer might help him, and he forgets him for 2 more years, and then things turn around. So that's the end of our story today. May you have a good week, and join me next week when we talk about when Joseph meets back up with the rest of his family. God bless you.